Chapter 6, Sections 1 and 2 combined. Our objective is to learn to estimate with percents, and our essential question, how do I compare and order decimals, fractions, and percents? Vocabulary, percent. Percents are ratios that compare a number to 100. If you break the word percent apart, it's two words, per and cent. Think about how many pennies are in a dollar, and that's 100, and that might help you remember that percent is always out of 100. So you can see we have ratios, decimals, and percents that are all equivalent. So 3/10 is equivalent to 30 hundredths, which is the same as the decimal 0.3 or 0.30, which is 30%. 1/2 is 50 over 100, which is 50% and 0.5. 3/4 is 75 over 100, 75% or 0.75. Think of the percent symbols meaning per 100, or like a slash 100, like a fraction. So 75% is the same as 75 out of 100, or 0.75, 75 hundredths. A student scored a 7 out of 8 on his quiz. What is his percent? We always take the part over the whole, so 7 over 8. So we would divide 7 by 8 and get 0.875. That's the decimal. To convert that to a percent, multiply by 100, or move the decimal twice, and follow that with the percent symbol. So that 7/8 fraction, which is 0.875 or 875 thousandths, is 87.5%. Find the missing ratio or percent equivalent for each letter A through G on the number line. We're looking for B. We're looking for part that's in the bottom of the number line, so that's a fraction. So we want to know what fraction is equivalent to 25%. That's a pretty common one, but if we didn't know, because it's a percent, we can start with 25 over 100 and reduce from there to get 1/4. Let's look for C. C we want as a percent. So we have the fraction 3/8. It's not easy to make that a denominator of 100, so the easiest thing would be to divide 3 by 8 and get 375 thousandths. Multiply by 100, you get 37.5 or 37.5%. Let's compare fractions and percentages and decimals. Using less than, greater than, or equal to. 1/4 compared to 40%. You can change the fraction to a percent, you could change the percent to a fraction. It's typically easier to compare percentages because fractions need common denominators most of the time. But 1/4 is a pretty common one. We know that's 25%. So really we're comparing 25% to 40%, and that would be less than. We have a decimal and a percent. You could get them both as decimals, both as percentages. Again, percentages are easier because then you're often comparing whole numbers. So if you multiply 0.893 by 100, you move the decimal twice. That's 89.3%. And 89.3% is greater than 50%. If we want to write these percentages, fractions, decimals in order from least to greatest, we need to get them in a common form. So we already have 0.075%, which is a very small number. 3/4 we know is the same as 75%, and 0.41 is 41%. So if we think of them all as percentages, then it's easy to rank them least to greatest. This is for section 2. Estimate, compatible numbers, and benchmark. An estimate is a useful answer that is close to the exact answer. Estimates involving percents and fractions can be found by using compatible numbers, which are numbers that go well together because they have common factors. When estimating with percents, it helps to know some benchmarks. Benchmarks are common numbers that serve as points of reference. Some common benchmarks for percents are shown in the table below. These are ones you'll be more familiar with. You may already know, or they're common enough that you will use them very frequently. So you can see the percent, the equivalent decimal, and the equivalent fraction all in simplest form. The 10% trick is kind of nice. If I want to find a 10%, a 5%, 30, 20 of a number, I can always do 10% by just moving the decimal one place to the left. So if I wanted to find, for example, 10% of 50, I would move the decimal, and that would equal 5. 10% of 24 would be 2.4. 10% of 36 would be 3.6. 10% of 110 would be 11. Okay, so if I want to find 5%, well, 5% is half of 10%. So once I've found 10%, which is 5, 5% would be half of that, which is 2.5. 5% of 24 would be half of 2.4, which is 1.2. 5% of 36 would be half of 3.6, which is 1.8. And then half of 11 would be 5.5. So how do I use this for other percentages? Well, 30%. If 10% is 5, 30% is 3 times 10. So I'd multiply 5 times 3 and get 15. 10% of 24 is 2.4, so I need to double that for 20%, 4.8. 10% of 36 is 3.6, so I need to multiply that by 4. So I would take 3.6 times 4, so I get 24, carry the 2, 3 times 4 is 12, plus 2 is 14, and I have one decimal place, so 14.4. And then if I need 60% of 110, 10% is 11, multiply that by 6 to get 66. So once you know 10%, you can find a lot of other percentages very quickly and easily. So let's estimate 21% of 66. Because it says estimate, we can change one or both of these values to make it easier to work with. So we might change 21% to 20%. That's the same as 1/5. And we could change 66 to 65 so that it's divisible by 5. Remember, you can also use the 10% trick here. So we could take 1/5 of 65 and get 13. You also could do the 10% trick, which would give you 6.5 and double that to get 13. Estimate 36% of 120. Instead of getting the exact answer, we might change 36% to 35%. That would equal 30% plus 5%. And 30% comes from 3 times 10%. So again, we use our 10% trick. So they broke it apart here to show us. But if you think about 10% of 120, 10% is going to equal 12. So 5% is going to equal 6. And 30% is going to equal 3 times 12, which is 36. And then if we ignore this and add 5 plus 30 to get 35%, add 6 plus 36, we get 42, which would be our estimate for 36% of 120. So estimate the way it works best for you, but if you get stuck, remember the 10% trick. Finish up your notes and be ready to move on.